When renowned black surgeon Dr. David Allen helps a frightened teenager at a diner, his simple act of kindness spirals into a nightmare. Wrongfully targeted by a biased police officer, David is humiliated, arrested, and accused without evidence. His success and status ignored in favor of dangerous stereotypes. The incident exposes a system where racial prejudice, abuse of power, and unchecked authority can destroy lives. As David fights back against the injustice, the story reveals the infuriating reality of how quickly assumptions turn into accusations, forcing him to confront a system stacked against him. The morning breeze swept gently through Chicago's O'Hare International Airport, carrying with it the hum of busy conversations, rolling luggage, and distant announcements echoing through the vast terminals. Among the sea of travelers was Naomi Stevens, a calm and composed woman in her late 30s, with a sense of quiet authority about her. Her black pumps clicked against the polished floor as she walked with purpose, her rolling suitcase gliding effortlessly behind her. Naomi was a civil rights attorney, sharp, relentless, and, most importantly, no stranger to standing her ground. She adjusted the strap of her leather satchel as she checked the gate information on the overhead monitor, Flight 738, Gate C-17. It was a routine work trip, nothing she hadn't done a dozen times before. Today, though, felt different. The feeling started small, just an unease lingering at the edge of her mind, though she quickly brushed it off as pre-meeting jitters. "Naomi!" a voice called from behind. She turned to see her younger colleague and mentee, Caleb, jogging up to her dressed sharply in a navy suit. Caleb was a bright-eyed junior associate, ambitious, and eager to prove himself. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee, one already half empty. "I got you your favorite, black. No sugar, figured you'd need the boost." Naomi smiled faintly. "You're a lifesaver, Caleb." He handed her the coffee and matched her pace as they continued toward their gate. Caleb's energy was infectious, and Naomi often admired his tenacity. They worked well together. Caleb's optimism balanced Naomi's methodical approach. "So," Caleb said, his tone playful, "ready to grill the city council into admitting they've been ignoring affordable housing laws?" Naomi smirked. "As ready as I'll ever be." They arrived at Gate C-17, which was already bustling with passengers. Naomi handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, who barely looked up as she scanned it. "You're in seat 3A, first class, enjoy your flight." Naomi nodded politely and stepped aside to let Caleb scan his. "See you when we land," she said, as he flashed a thumbs up and headed toward economy. The first-class cabin was quiet and pristine, the kind of space where time seemed to slow. Naomi stored her bag in the overhead compartment and settled into her window seat. She exhaled deeply, pulling out her tablet to review notes for their meeting later that afternoon. A moment later, she noticed a commotion in the aisle. A middle-aged man, sharp-featured and stern, was blocking a flight attendant's path. "I don't care what the list says," he muttered under his breath. "You need to check again." The flight attendant, a younger woman named Sarah, with a polite yet strained expression, maintained her composure. "Sir, I assure you we're reviewing the situation, but the seating arrangements are correct." Naomi's focus wavered as the man's tone grew harsher. She glanced over just in time to see his sharp glare shift toward her. Their eyes met for the briefest of moments, and Naomi saw something familiar in his expression, a mix of arrogance and entitlement. As Sarah ushered him further down the aisle, Naomi's attention returned to her tablet, though a faint knot twisted in her stomach. It was nothing, she told herself. Just another difficult passenger causing trouble. It happened all the time. The plane boarded quickly, and soon the doors were sealed. Naomi leaned back as the engines roared to life, carrying them up into a sky streaked with morning light. The hum of the engines filled the cabin as the attendants began moving through their pre-flight routine. Naomi was halfway through reviewing a legal brief when a shadow fell across her seat. She looked up to see another flight attendant, this one older with a commanding presence, standing beside her. Her name tag read Claire Jensen. Claire's lips were pressed into a thin line, and something about her demeanor felt off. "Excuse me, ma'am," Claire said, her voice firm and devoid of warmth. "I need to see your boarding pass." Naomi blinked, taken aback. "My boarding pass?" she repeated. "I already had it scanned at the gate." "I'm aware," Claire replied, her tone sharp. "But I need to confirm your seat assignment." Naomi frowned, sensing the unusual tension in the woman's voice. Still, she complied, retrieving her phone and pulling up the boarding pass. Claire took a long moment to scrutinize the screen. "This is for 3A, she said slowly, as though the words tasted bitter. "Are you sure this is your seat?" Naomi's brow furrowed. Her voice remained calm, but carried a quiet edge of irritation. "Yes, I paid for this seat. Is there an issue?" Claire hesitated, her gaze lingering on Naomi longer than necessary. Then, she handed the phone back stiffly. "No issue," she muttered. Thank you." Naomi watched her retreat toward the galley, her posture stiff and movements clipped. Around her, passengers seemed oblivious to the exchange, yet Naomi couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over her. It wasn't just the request, it was how it had been made. The look in Claire's eyes, the doubt in her tone. Naomi had seen it before, and she knew the flight was only just beginning. The coffee shop on the corner of Maple and 14th was the kind of place that didn't ask questions. Its cracked linoleum floors and faded booths carried decades of memories, yet no one seemed to care about history here. The air always smelled like burnt toast and overbrewed coffee, the kind that sat on the burner too long but still warmed the soul. For most customers, this place was a brief stop, a pause in a life of chaos. But for Dr. David Allen, it was a pocket of peace. David sat alone in the farthest booth from the door, an open journal in front of him, and a steaming cup of coffee by his side. The early morning light poured through the wide front windows, cutting soft streaks across the dark mahogany of his skin. He wore a simple gray sweater and dark jeans, clothes that made him easy to overlook, despite the quiet command in his posture. To anyone glancing his way, he was just another middle-aged man lost in thought. No one would guess he was one of the top neurosurgeons in the state of Georgia, a man whose hands had saved more lives than he could count. Fewer still would know that he was also the head of a non-profit dedicated to improving health equity across underserved black communities, or that last month he'd turned down an offer to lead a high-profile medical board because it didn't align with his principles. David didn't care much for recognition. His work spoke louder than any applause. He glanced up as the door jingled, and another wave of early risers shuffled in. Construction workers with dirt-streaked boots, a tired mother juggling 2 kids, a young man wearing a suit, far too big for him. David loved this about the shop. Here, everyone blended together, their lives overlapping for just a moment over coffee cups and bacon grease. As he scribbled a note into the margins of his journal, something about an upcoming surgery, Martha, the waitress, approached with a notepad tucked into her apron. She'd been working at the shop for as long as David had been coming here, her hair a soft gray now, her smile warm but tired. "Need a refill, sugar?" she asked, holding up the carafe. David looked up and smiled, his deep voice as gentle as a breeze. "Please," she poured without asking, knowing his habits by now. "You're in here earlier than usual." "Early morning board meeting," David replied, glancing at his watch. "But I couldn't miss my routine." "You doctors work too hard," Martha said, shaking her head. "A man needs more rest than that." David chuckled softly. "If I ever figure out how to get rest, you'll be the first to know." Martha grinned and moved on, leaving David alone once more. Outside, the hum of the city was slowly picking up, the sounds of delivery trucks groaning to a stop and commuters arguing with traffic lights. Atlanta was a city of contrasts. Gleaming skyscrapers stood side by side with aging neighborhoods still clawing for opportunity. Despite its beauty, despite the progress, the invisible lines of privilege and prejudice ran through its streets like veins, dictating whose voices were heard and whose were ignored. David knew those lines well. He had crossed them, erased them, and sometimes rebuilt them when necessary. His name carried weight in rooms that often didn't expect a black man to walk through the door. Yet, he never carried himself with pride. At least not the kind people assumed came with power. The door jingled again, and David's attention shifted instinctively. A young man stepped inside, college-aged by the look of him, with a backpack slung carelessly over one shoulder and a hoodie pulled low over his eyes. He stood for a moment, scanning the room as if looking for something. His gaze lingered on David before flicking away, dismissing him as unimportant. David went back to his journal, but he felt the faint twinge of something beneath the surface. It was the way the young man's eyes had darted around, cautious and calculating. He looked like someone trying not to be noticed, which, in David's experience, often meant trouble. Minutes passed, and David was halfway through a paragraph when the door opened again. This time, 2 men in dark suits entered, the sharp cut of their clothes at odds with the shop's grungy atmosphere. They looked around, their eyes narrowing slightly, before they headed straight for the counter. David's focus lingered on them for a second too long, and one of the men, tall, with a square jaw and a face that looked incapable of smiling, turned his head slightly, his gaze locking onto David's. There was a flicker of something there. An unspoken judgment. David didn't flinch. Instead, he turned back to his notes, his pen moving smoothly across the page. Over the years, he'd learned how to disarm people without saying a word. A calm demeanor, a steady gaze, and silence that demanded they show their hand first. "Excuse me," a voice said sharply. David looked up to find the younger man standing at the edge of his table now, a nervous energy rolling off him in waves. Up close, David could see the faint sheen of sweat on his brow. "Can I help you?" David asked evenly. The young man shifted from one foot to the other, his eyes darting toward the men in suits. "You wouldn't happen to have a phone charger, would you? Mine's dead, and I really need to make a call." David studied him for a beat, before nodding slowly. He reached into his bag and pulled out a neatly coiled charger. "Here," he said, offering it. The young man snatched it a little too quickly, mumbling a rushed, "Thanks," before backing away toward a nearby outlet. The men at the counter watched the exchange closely, their eyes narrowing as if they were cataloging every detail. David sipped his coffee, his gaze flicking from the young man to the suited men, and back again. Something was happening here, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it yet. "Excuse me, sir," one of the men called out suddenly, his voice cutting across the low hum of conversation. The room fell into a hush as every pair of eyes turned toward them. David looked up slowly, his expression neutral. "Yes?" The man approached the table, his polished shoes clicking against the linoleum. "Can I ask what your relationship is with that young man?" David blinked, his brow lifting slightly. "I'm sorry, what?" The man gestured toward the corner where the college-aged kid was still crouched over his phone, his back hunched as if trying to disappear. "The boy, you gave him something. Do you know him?" David's jaw tightened subtly, but his voice remained calm. "No, I don't. He asked for a charger, so I lent him one. Is there a problem?" The man exchanged a look with his partner, who was still hovering near the counter. "It's just unusual to see someone your age and status interacting with someone like him in a place like this." The words lingered in the air like smoke, thinly veiled but unmistakable. David set his pen down, folding his hands carefully on the table. "Someone like him?" he repeated quietly. The man's mouth opened as if to clarify, but before he could, Martha's voice rang out from across the room. "Is there a reason you're bothering my customer?" she demanded, her hands on her hips, and her voice sharp as a knife. The man turned toward her, caught off guard by the force of her presence. "Ma'am, we're just trying to—" "You're trying to what?" Martha cut him off. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're making a whole lot of assumptions about people who've done nothing wrong." A ripple of murmurs spread through the diner as customers shifted uncomfortably, their gazes flicking between David and the men. David smiled faintly. "It's all right, Martha," he said softly, rising to his feet. At his full height, he towered slightly over the man in the suit, his presence quiet but unmistakably commanding. He turned his gaze back to the man. "If you're finished, I'd like to enjoy my coffee now." The man hesitated, as though unsure whether to press further. Finally, he muttered something under his breath and turned toward the door, signaling for his partner to follow. David watched them go, his calm exterior masking the slow burn building in his chest. He glanced toward the young man in the corner, who was staring at him now with wide, grateful eyes. "Thank you," the kid mouthed, his voice lost beneath the din of the shop. David gave a small nod, then sank back into his seat, his coffee now cold. Outside, the suits climbed into a black SUV and disappeared into the growing morning traffic. But David knew this wasn't the end of it. David sat in the booth for a long moment after the 2 suited men left, staring at his now lukewarm coffee. The air in the diner still hummed with residual tension, every glance in his direction carrying questions people were too polite, or afraid, to voice. Martha's voice had returned to a friendlier hum as she chatted with regulars, but every few seconds, her eyes darted back to David with unspoken concern. He appreciated her stepping in. Most people wouldn't have. "Let me warm that up for you," she said, suddenly at his side again with the coffee carafe. Her voice was softer now, like she was trying to make up for something she had no part in. David looked up, his calm smile returning. "Thanks, Martha." She poured and lingered for a moment. "You sure you're all right, sugar?" "I'm fine," David replied gently. It was a lie, at least partly. But he wasn't in the habit of burdening others with things they couldn't fix. Martha studied him for a beat longer, then gave a curt nod. "Those fellas looked like trouble." "They often do." She left him with that, retreating to the counter as another wave of customers filtered in. David glanced toward the far corner, but the young man had slipped out sometime after the suits left. His phone charger still lay coiled by the outlet, forgotten in his haste. David pocketed it. The rest of the morning moved in its usual slow rhythm. David kept his focus on his notes, forcing his mind to settle. By the time he left the diner, the two men had faded into a bothersome memory. One more story to add to his mental archive of assumptions and quiet battles. He stepped out onto the sidewalk, the cold air biting at his face, as the city woke in earnest around him. David had barely made it to his car, a sleek but unassuming black sedan, when he heard the voice. "Sir, excuse me, sir." He turned and found himself facing two uniformed police officers, their expressions blank but intent. One was tall and broad-shouldered, his partner shorter with a trim mustache that twitched as he spoke. Behind them, a patrol car idled at the curb, its lights off, but presence unmistakable. David's pulse ticked upward. He knew that look, the kind that landed on him when someone couldn't square his appearance with where he was, or what he owned. "Can I help you, officers?" David asked evenly, his tone measured. The taller officer stepped forward. "We've had a report about a suspicious individual in the area, matches your description." David raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious how?" The officer's eyes narrowed slightly, but his voice remained cool. "Loitering. Possibly harassing customers. We need to ask you a few questions." David inhaled slowly, keeping his composure. "I've been sitting in the diner across the street for the past hour. You're welcome to confirm that with the staff." The shorter officer's mustache twitched again. "Will do that. Mind showing us some ID in the meantime?" David hesitated, not because he didn't have it, but because he was tired of this routine. How many times had he been asked to prove he belonged somewhere, a park, a conference hall, even his own neighborhood once, when he'd been out for an early morning run? It never mattered that he wore the confidence of a man who had earned his place. To some, his skin was enough to raise suspicion. He reached into his pocket slowly and pulled out his wallet, flipping it open to reveal his driver's license. "Here." The taller officer took it, his expression unreadable as he examined the ID. David kept his hands visible, his posture relaxed, every movement deliberate. He'd learned long ago how to make himself appear non-threatening. "And what brings you to this part of town?" the shorter officer asked, his voice carrying the faint edge of accusation. David tilted his head slightly. "Is that relevant?" The officer's jaw tightened. "Just answer the question, sir." David exhaled, forcing down the heat that bubbled in his chest. "I was having coffee. I come here often." The taller officer glanced back at the diner, where Martha now stood in the window, arms crossed and glaring at the scene unfolding. He handed David's ID back, though his expression still held skepticism, as if something about David didn't quite add up. "You're free to go," he said finally. David slid his wallet back into his pocket, his gaze steady. "Am I?" The officer's eyes flickered. A flash of something. Guilt, perhaps, or irritation at being challenged. "Have a good day, sir," he said stiffly, before turning back toward the patrol car. His partner followed, glancing over his shoulder once more, as if to check that David wasn't about to sprout wings and fly off. David waited until they were gone, the sound of the patrol car fading into the distance. He turned toward the diner, meeting Martha's gaze through the glass. She lifted a hand in solidarity, and he nodded faintly before sliding into his car. His hands tightened briefly on the steering wheel as he sat there, the silence of the vehicle a stark contrast to the low hum of anger in his veins. Moments like this were like paper cuts, small, sharp, but too many could leave you bleeding. He pulled his phone from the passenger seat and dialed a number. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Dr. Allen," said Marie Chambers, his assistant, her voice brisk and cheerful. "Your board meeting starts in 20 minutes. Are you close?" "I'll be there," David replied. "Could you also reach out to the team at Health Equity Atlanta? I want to revisit our community workshop on racial bias in professional settings. Let's move it up the calendar." There was a slight pause on the other end. Marie knew him well enough to catch the undertone. "Of course, everything all right?" "Just fine," David said, his tone even. "I'll see you soon." He hung up, started the car, and pulled onto the street. By the time David arrived at the hospital's administrative wing, he had tucked the morning's events into the back of his mind. A meeting with the hospital's executive board awaited him, and David was a man who showed up prepared, no matter the circumstances. The boardroom was already buzzing when he stepped inside. A spacious, glass-walled room with a sweeping view of the city skyline. Men and women in tailored suits clustered around the table, their conversations weaving together in a hum of ambition and self-importance. "Dr. Allen," a voice called from the far end of the room. Edward Hensley, the hospital's chief financial officer, stood with his hands tucked neatly into his pockets. "Good to see you. We were just about to begin." David nodded in greeting, sliding into his seat at the head of the table. Around him, the energy shifted subtly, the conversations slowing as the board members settled into their places. Some of them had worked with David for years. Others were newer, still adjusting to the idea of a black man holding one of the highest positions in the institution. David opened his notes, ready to dive into the agenda. But before he could speak, Edward cleared his throat. "There's one matter I'd like to address before we begin," Edward said, his tone careful but pointed. "We've received a report that you were involved in an incident with law enforcement earlier this morning. Is everything all right?" David's pen stilled over the paper. His eyes lifted to meet Edward's across the table, and for a moment, the room felt too quiet. "It was a misunderstanding," David said calmly. "Nothing worth mentioning." Edward gave a thin smile. "Of course, but we do have to be mindful of how these things reflect on the hospital, particularly given your position." The words hung in the air like smoke, their implication clear. David's grip on his pen tightened. He kept his voice steady, but there was no mistaking the edge beneath it. "And what exactly do you think reflects on the hospital, Edward?" The CFO hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "You didn't mean to suggest that my being questioned, without cause, has anything to do with my ability to lead this hospital," David interrupted smoothly. "Because if that's what you're implying, I'd be happy to clarify." The room was silent. No one dared move as David's gaze swept over the table. Finally, Edward shifted back, his face pale. "That's not what I meant," he muttered. "Good," David said, his voice calm but cutting. "Then let's get back to the agenda." He turned his attention to his notes, the tension still thick in the air. Around the table, a few board members exchanged glances, their faces unreadable. David didn't care. He'd earned his place in this room 100 times over, and he wouldn't let anyone, even subtly, call that into question. The meeting continued, but David could feel the weight of their stares, the unspoken discomfort of people who didn't quite know what to do with him. It was a familiar feeling. The board meeting ended without further incident, though the undercurrent of unease still lingered in David's mind, like static on an untuned radio. Edward Hensley's words replayed over and over, each iteration grating a little deeper. "We do have to be mindful of how these things reflect on the hospital." David left the administrative wing with his jaw set, his phone buzzing quietly in his pocket. He ignored it for now, needing a moment to gather himself. The hospital lobby stretched before him, white marble floors, clean lines, and bustling staff moving between patients and paperwork. This was his second home, the space where he felt most confident and in control. But this morning, even here, the weight of perception felt suffocating. "Dr. Allen!" David turned at the sound of his name and spotted Mitchell Barnes jogging toward him. Mitchell was a young, wide-eyed resident who had been under David's wing for nearly 2 years. He looked nervous, his usual easy smile missing. "Mitchell," David greeted, softening his expression. "What's on your mind?" Mitchell glanced around the busy lobby as if unsure whether to speak. Finally, he lowered his voice. "Sir, I overheard some of the board members after the meeting. They were talking." David's brow furrowed. "About what?" Mitchell shifted awkwardly. "About the incident this morning. Hensley was concerned. I guess he said something about optics, and whether the hospital needs to, distance itself." David's expression didn't waver, though his stomach tightened. "Distance itself?" Mitchell nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. I don't think it's fair. Everyone knows how much you've done for this hospital. For all of us, I thought you should know." "Thank you, Mitchell," David said after a pause, his voice calm but laced with steel. "I appreciate it." Mitchell gave him a small nod before hurrying off to his next rotation. David stood still for a moment, the hum of the hospital swirling around him like white noise distance itself. He clenched his hands briefly, feeling the anger press against his ribs, before releasing a slow breath. The parking garage felt quieter than usual as David walked toward his car, his footsteps echoing against the concrete. The fluorescent lights above flickered faintly, making the space feel colder, emptier. He'd parked near the back corner, habit, mostly, since the area was always quiet. He reached for the door handle when a voice cut through the silence. "Dr. Allen!" David turned sharply to find the 2 officers from earlier, Officer Daniels, the taller one, and his mustached partner, striding toward him, their faces serious. Behind them, 2 more uniformed officers followed, their hands resting on their belts. David's pulse quickened, though his expression remained steady. "Officers," he said, his tone carefully even. "What brings you here?" Daniels stopped a few feet away, his height adding to his already imposing presence. "We need you to come with us, sir," he said, his voice clipped. David frowned, his mind racing. "Excuse me?" The mustached officer stepped forward, holding up a piece of paper. "We have a warrant for your arrest." The words hit David like a fist to the chest. For a moment, he thought he'd misheard them. "A warrant?" he repeated, his voice low and incredulous. "For what?" Daniels held up a hand, as if already anticipating a fight. "You're being charged with obstructing an investigation and tampering with evidence." David blinked, his heart pounding in his ears. "Evidence? What evidence?" "We'll discuss that at the station," Daniels said curtly. "Turn around and put your hands on the car." David stayed rooted where he stood, the absurdity of the situation freezing him in place. "This is a mistake," he said firmly. "Whatever you think I've done?" "Sir, I won't ask again," Daniels said, his tone darkening. "Turn around now." David looked at the officers, his gaze sharp as steel. Around him, the air felt too still, the walls of the parking garage pressing closer. He could see it clearly now. The trap, the manufactured story, the way they had orchestrated this from the moment they'd spotted him in the diner. The young man from earlier, the suits Daniels pieces of a puzzle he hadn't realized he was part of. And suddenly, David knew. "This is about the boy in the diner, isn't it?" he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made the officers shift. "You're trying to pin something on him, and you think I helped him." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The silence was confirmation enough. "This is nonsense," David continued, his voice rising slightly. "I lent that boy a phone charger. That's it. If you had any real evidence, you wouldn't need to fabricate charges to justify your harassment." "Turn around," Daniels barked, his hand moving to the cuffs at his belt. The tension in the air was electric now, crackling like a storm about to break. David looked at the officer, his composure wavering for the first time. His every instinct told him to resist, to fight back, to refuse to comply with an injustice he knew was rotten to its core. But another voice, one he'd heard too many times in his life, whispered of the risks. "Stay calm. Stay alive." He exhaled slowly, hands curling into fists, before he raised them in surrender. Without a word, he turned and placed his palms flat against the cold surface of his car. The metal cuffs snapped around his wrists, tight and unyielding. "You're making a mistake," David said, his voice low but steady, as they pulled him away from the car. "You're going to regret this." Daniels didn't respond, but the smug tilt of his chin said enough. The station was dim and fluorescent, its walls scuffed, and its air thick with the stale scent of coffee and sweat. David sat alone in a small interrogation room, his wrists sore from the cuffs they'd left on too long. A one-way mirror stretched across the wall, hiding faces he couldn't see. He knew they were watching him, though, waiting for him to break. He wouldn't give them that satisfaction. The door finally opened, and Daniels walked in, his expression hard and triumphant. He sat across from David, a thin folder in his hands. "We've got a problem, Dr. Allen," Daniels said, dropping the folder onto the table. "Seems you interfered with our investigation this morning. That boy, he's a suspect in a robbery across town, and here you are, helping him skip town." David met his gaze evenly. "I didn't help anyone skip town, I gave a stranger a phone charger. That's hardly a crime." Daniel's lips curved into a thin, humorless smile. "We'll let the evidence decide that." David leaned forward slightly, his calm exterior cracking just enough to let the fire beneath show. "You're not looking for evidence, you're looking for a scapegoat, and you think I'm the easy target." Daniel's smile faltered. "Watch your tone." David didn't flinch. "Or what, you'll add another charge to the list? Go ahead. I've spent my entire life proving men like you wrong." The words hit Daniels like a slap, his face darkening. For a moment, he seemed ready to lash out, but then he stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. "You can sit here and talk tough all you want," he snapped. "But you're not walking out of here until we say so." He turned and stalked out of the room, slamming the door behind him. David sat back in his chair, the fire still burning in his chest. He could feel the weight of the system pressing down on him, on his name, on his reputation, on his life. The stakes were high, but David's resolve was higher. He glanced at the mirror and spoke softly, as if to whoever was listening. "I'm not going anywhere, and when this is over, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what you've done." David sat in the interrogation room, the cheap plastic chair digging into his back. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, marking each second of his forced patience. The stillness was oppressive, broken only by the faint sound of movement outside the door. Footsteps, low voices, the sound of papers being shuffled. He had spent the better part of his life commanding attention in operating rooms, board meetings, and classrooms, his voice carrying authority and calm. Yet here, in this cramped space with peeling paint and flickering fluorescent lights, they wanted to strip him of everything, his dignity, his reputation, and his power. David had seen this before. He'd heard the stories, read the headlines, even fought against the very systems that turned suspicion into a weapon. But now, he was the headline. The door creaked open, and Officer Daniels reappeared, smug and self-assured, as he dropped into the chair across from David. Behind him came a man in a rumpled gray suit, carrying a legal pad and an air of practiced indifference. "This here's Detective Callahan," Daniels said, gesturing vaguely. "He's got a few more questions for you." Callahan sat down, loosening his tie with one hand while flipping open the legal pad with the other. He peered at David, his gaze assessing, though not overtly hostile. "Dr. Allen, you know why you're here?" David's gaze didn't waver. "Not a clue, Detective. As I've already explained to Officer Daniels, I gave a young man a phone charger this morning. That's the extent of my involvement in whatever this is." Callahan leaned back slightly, clicking his pen against the pad. "Here's the thing, we have security footage from the diner. It shows you handing something to the suspect." "The phone charger," David replied calmly. "As I said." "Why'd you give it to him?" "Because he asked for it," David said, his voice firm but measured. "I had no reason to believe he was anything but a kid needing help." Daniels snorted, shaking his head. "No reason? Come on, Dr. Allen. A kid in a hoodie looking shifty as hell, and you just handed him something. Didn't seem odd to you?" David's jaw tightened, but his tone remained steady. "Odd how? Because he looked like someone you've already decided is guilty." The temperature in the room dropped. Daniels leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. "You don't get to play the victim here, Doc, not when you're obstructing justice." "I haven't obstructed anything," David shot back, the edge in his voice sharpening. "But you seem intent on creating a narrative that fits your prejudice." Daniels flinched, a flicker of anger crossing his face. "Watch yourself." "Enough!" Callahan cut in, his tone exasperated. He turned back to David. "Here's where we stand. The boy from this morning, Tyrone Jackson, matches the description of a suspect in a robbery. Cash was stolen from a gas station about an hour before you saw him. You gave him away to disappear. That looks bad for you, Doctor." David's chest tightened, but his mind worked fast, piecing the puzzle together. "Did anyone see him commit this robbery?" Callahan hesitated. "We're working on that." David's brow lifted. "So no witness, just suspicion, and a hoodie." Daniels's face turned a shade darker. "We don't need a lecture from you." David ignored him, his gaze locked on Callahan. "You've got nothing, you're grasping at shadows, and you know it." Callahan didn't respond, but David saw the doubt in his eyes. Daniels, however, seemed immune to reason. "Let's make one thing clear," David said slowly, his voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "You're trying to connect me to a crime without evidence. Why? Because I happened to help a young black man who fit your stereotype of suspicious. That's not justice, officer, that's harassment." Daniels shot up from his chair, the force of his movement scraping the legs against the tile floor. "You don't get to talk to me about justice," he barked, his face flushed. "People like you think you're above the law." "People like me?" David's voice rose slightly, the calm cracking just enough to reveal the anger underneath. He stood, his imposing frame dwarfing Daniels' attempts to intimidate him. "Let's be very clear, officer. You don't know a damn thing about me." Callahan rose, holding up his hands to de-escalate. "All right, let's settle down." Daniels glared at David, his breathing heavy, but didn't speak. David straightened, his composure returning. "I've told you everything I know. Either charge me with something, or let me go. But I suggest you think long and hard about the kind of storm you're going to create if you keep me here on nothing but your assumptions." Outside the room, the hallway buzzed with activity. Through the thin walls, David could hear voices, some low and urgent, others raised in frustration. Time dragged on, each minute stretching longer than the last. Finally, the door opened again, but this time it wasn't Daniels or Callahan. It was a familiar face, Mitchell Barnes, his young resident, standing nervously in the doorway. Behind him stood Marie Chambers, David's assistant, her heels clicking like gunshots as she entered the room. "Dr. Allen," Marie said, her tone all business, though David saw the fire in her eyes. "We're taking you out of here." David's shoulders eased slightly. "Marie." She turned toward Callahan, who had followed them into the room, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "You're holding one of the most respected surgeons in this state with no charges and no evidence," she said sharply. "His attorney is already en route, and the media has been notified. If Dr. Allen isn't released immediately, you'll be answering far more questions than you're prepared for." Callahan rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding David's gaze. "We're still—" "You're done," Marie interrupted. "And I suggest you tell your colleague Daniels to watch his temper around professionals who outrank him in every possible way." Callahan sighed and nodded. "We're letting him go." Daniels's muffled protest echoed from the hallway, but it was short-lived. Mitchell stepped closer to David, his voice low. "I called Marie the moment I heard I couldn't just let this happen." David gave him a nod of appreciation. "Thank you, Mitchell." Marie placed a hand on David's arm. "Let's go." The station lobby felt oppressively quiet as David walked through it, his head held high. Officers turned to watch him, their expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort. Marie matched his pace, her sharp presence a shield against anyone who dared stop them. Outside, the late afternoon sun cut through the clouds, casting long shadows across the pavement. A few reporters were already gathered near the entrance, cameras poised and questions flying. David paused for a moment, taking in the scene. "Dr. Allen," one reporter called, "can you comment on what happened inside?" David met the man's gaze, his expression calm but resolute. "Not yet," he said simply. "But soon." Marie ushered him toward the waiting car, her voice quiet. "We're going to handle this, Dr. Allen. They picked the wrong man to mess with." David slid into the back seat, his gaze distant as he stared out the window. His mind raced, already strategizing, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Daniels and his department had chosen him as their scapegoat, but David would make sure they regretted it. Because this wasn't just about him, it was about every person they had targeted, silenced, or forced to fight battles they should never have faced. As the car pulled away from the curb, David leaned back, his voice quiet but unyielding. "Call Justine," he said, referring to his attorney, "and get me a meeting with the hospital board. It's time I reminded everyone exactly who I am." Marie glanced at him through the rearview mirror, a faint smile on her lips. "Yes, sir." The conference room at the hospital buzzed with an uneasy tension, the kind that hung heavy in the air before a storm. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly as executives, board members, and department heads filed in one by one. Their polished shoes clicked against the marble floor, their voices low and measured as they exchanged glances. Some of them looked at David with thinly veiled curiosity. Others avoided his gaze entirely, their discomfort obvious. David sat at the far end of the long oak table, his hands folded in front of him. He had requested this meeting, and now, as he waited, the weight of what was to come settled squarely on his shoulders. He'd fought battles before, quietly, methodically. But this one was different. This time, they had tried to strip him of his dignity, his authority, and his very identity, and he wasn't about to let it stand. The doors swung open, and Edward Hensley entered, his presence sucking the air from the room. Behind him, a few senior board members followed, their faces taut with polite neutrality. Hensley, always the showman, adjusted his suit jacket as he took his seat across from David. "Dr. Allen," Hensley began, his tone cool, clipped. "Thank you for joining us on such short notice." David met his gaze evenly. "I didn't have much of a choice, did I?" Hensley's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly. "We're here to discuss the events of the past 24 hours, and how they reflect on this institution. I think I speak for everyone when I say we are deeply concerned about the situation you found yourself in." David leaned back slightly, his voice calm but sharp. "The situation I've found myself in." "Careful, Edward. You're implying this was my doing." Hensley's expression tightened, but before he could respond, the doors opened again. Officer Daniels entered, flanked by Detective Callahan and two other uniformed officers. Daniels walked with the swagger of someone who thought he had already won. His smug grin widened as his gaze landed on David. "What is he doing here?" David's voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a knife. Hensley cleared his throat. "Dr. Allen, these officers are here to provide context regarding the investigation into yesterday's events. Given the hospital's reputation, it's important that we hear from all parties involved." David's eyes didn't leave Daniels. "And what exactly are you hoping they'll say, Edward? That I'm some criminal mastermind, that a neurosurgeon with 30 years of spotless work suddenly decided to aid and abet a robbery?" Daniels stepped forward, his hands clasped behind his back as if he were delivering a lecture. "We're not saying that, doctor," he said smoothly, though his tone dripped with condescension. "But the evidence—" "What evidence?" David shot back, his voice rising. "You have nothing but a boy in a hoodie, and your assumptions. You cuffed me in a parking garage, humiliated me, and dragged me into a station without a shred of proof. Do you know how many hours of surgery I've performed this week? How many lives I've saved while you've been out harassing innocent people?" "Calm down," Daniels said, smirking slightly. "You're not in charge here." David stood, his full height casting a shadow across the table. "Oh, but I am in charge here. This hospital, this boardroom, these are my domains. You think a badge gives you power, officer? Let me show you what real power looks like." The room fell silent. Even Daniels faltered under David's unflinching gaze. David turned to the board members, his voice steady and unwavering. "Let's talk about context. You want to know what happened yesterday? I'll tell you." He glanced briefly at Daniels before continuing. "I sat in a diner, one I've been visiting for years, reviewing notes for an upcoming surgery. A young man approached me. He looked exhausted, frightened, like someone who'd seen too much in too little time. He asked to borrow my phone charger. I lent it to him. That was the extent of our interaction." David's voice sharpened. "Minutes later these two," he gestured toward Daniels and Callahan, "show up and drag me into their so-called investigation. They had no evidence, no witnesses, just a suspect who happened to look like someone they've already decided is guilty. That's not. Daniels started, but David's voice thundered over him. Don't interrupt me. The force in David's tone made Daniels flinch. David stepped closer to the table, his eyes sweeping across the room. I've spent my life building a reputation. My work has saved countless lives, and yet here I stand, defending myself against thinly veiled accusations and half-truths, because certain people, his eyes locked on Daniels, are too afraid to examine their own biases. Daniels' face flushed red, but he said nothing. Callahan, standing beside him, looked visibly uncomfortable, his gaze shifting toward the floor. David turned back to the board. You think this reflects poorly on the hospital? On me? You're wrong. What reflects poorly is staying silent in the face of injustice. This, he pointed toward Daniels, is what we're up against every day. Systems built on suspicion, on prejudice, on assumptions about who belongs where and why. Marie, seated at the far end of the table, gave a faint nod of encouragement, her expression fierce and proud. Mitchell, who had quietly slipped into the back of the room, looked ready to jump to his feet and applaud. Here's what I propose, David continued, his voice calm but unrelenting. You have two options. You can allow yourselves to be complicit, to stand by while the reputation of this hospital and its staff is dragged through the mud by men like this. He gestured toward Daniels, whose anger now simmered visibly. Or you can stand with me. You can make it clear that this hospital supports integrity, truth, and justice. You can send a message, to your staff, to your patients, and to this city, that you will not tolerate bias, harassment, or abuse of authority in any form. The silence was deafening. Daniels looked ready to explode, his fists clenched at his sides. But before he could speak, Callahan stepped forward, clearing his throat. Dr. Allen, Callahan said, his voice quieter, steadier. You're right, we don't have evidence Officer Daniels may have overstepped. Daniels spun toward him, furious. What are you doing? Callahan ignored him. It's clear that this investigation was mishandled. You're free to go, Doctor, and on behalf of the department, I'll see to it that this is addressed internally. David stared at Callahan, reading the man's sincerity, or perhaps his exhaustion. Either way, it didn't matter. Daniels had been cut off at the knees, his authority crumbling under the weight of his own failure. You can't be serious, Daniels growled, his face red with rage. This man, Callahan turned sharply. That's enough, Daniels. For a moment, David thought Daniels might lunge at the detective, but instead, he stormed from the room, the door slamming hard enough to rattle the walls. The silence that followed was thick. Hensley looked pale, his carefully composed mask slipping as he turned to David. Dr. Allen. David held up a hand, cutting him off. Save it, Edward. You've heard what I had to say. Now you'll decide where you stand. With that, David turned and walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing like the closing notes of a symphony. In the hallway, Mitchell was waiting, his face flushed with excitement. Dr. Allen, that was incredible. You showed them exactly who you are. David nodded faintly, though the adrenaline still coursed through him. I didn't show them anything, Mitchell, I reminded them. Marie appeared at his side, her voice low. The press is already calling you're a hero, Dr. Allen. This isn't just about you anymore, it's bigger than that. David exhaled slowly, the weight of everything settling over him. He thought of the boy in the diner, Tyrone, and countless others who had been silenced, dismissed, and ignored. This is far from over, he said quietly. But now they know, I won't be silent. As David stepped through the hospital's front doors into the bright afternoon light, reporters gathered, cameras flashing and voices shouting questions. He paused, looked directly at the crowd, and spoke the words that would travel further than he ever imagined.